Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. was an eminent American jurist and Supreme Court justice whose impact on the nation's legal landscape was profound. He came from a distinguished family with a rich intellectual heritage. As a young man, he served in the Civil War and many years later took a seat on the High Court, which he held for 3 decades. Stephen Budiansky is author of the book Oliver Wendell Holmes, A Life in War, Laws and Ideas. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. had that long tenure as a jurist. What was his impact on the law and the way it's practiced in America?
Well, Holmes had an enormous impact for no other reason than he lived so long. And he served 20 years on the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. And then in 1901, at age 61, when most normal people are thinking about retirement, he's appointed by Theodore Roosevelt to the U.S. Supreme Court, where he served for nearly 3 decades. Some of his most important and famous decisions were actually dissents that later were adopted by the court as the law of the land on free speech, the rights of criminal defendants to a fair trial, ending the long-standing reactionary practice of the Supreme Court in striking down any laws protecting the rights of workers or consumers or economic regulation.
I watched a book talk you gave in Washington a while back on Holmes, and you did explain the challenge of covering his life because he lived so long. He was 93 years old. He did so much, but let's start in those early years, Mr. Budiansky. Where was Holmes from, and what was his upbringing like?
Well, he was from Boston, and very much from Boston, of upper-class Boston society. His father, namesake Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., was a household name. He was a poet. He wrote the famous poem Old Ironside, calling on the U.S. Navy not to dismantle the famous warship from the War of 1812. He was a co-founder of the Atlantic Monthly magazine, wrote these humorous essays called The Autocrat of the Breakfast Table, literally known around the world. He was like Mark Twain a generation earlier. And Holmes's father coined the term Boston Brahmin, which certainly described his family. It was a very intellectual upbringing. It was a secure upbringing, and Holmes said after his experience in fighting the Civil War, he said the world never seemed quite the same again. But certainly his rooting in, the son of this great wit, you can see that in Holmes Jr. in almost everything he did and said, and this man who had a great natural way with words. And I think still, despite, having been his world shaken by his Civil War service in many ways, he still was a man who went through the world with incredible confidence, which came from this upbringing and self-confidence. And, the interesting thing to me about his Civil War experience was it didn't make him a cynic. It didn't make him a nihilist or a hedonist. It made him, recognize the limits of human certainty, the limits of ability of anyone to control their lives. And yet he, one of his famous phrases he would say to all of his friends, he said, the only solution is to file in and do your damnedest. And he said, you should always be an enthusiast in the front part of your mind and a skeptic in the back. And that's the thing that really comes through, I think, about his personality so strongly for me. And, a lot of this, as I mentioned, really, I think comes from that kind of, upper-class confidence. But it's interesting how the Civil War, in a way, matured and deepened that rather than overthrew that sense of confidence towards life.
I do want to talk more about the Civil War in a moment. I did hear you mention in that book talk some of the friends and other people, other acquaintances that Holmes had growing up, many names that we would actually recognize. Give us a sample. Who were some of them, and what was their impact on his life?
Well, it was an incredible array of friendships he had in the political world, literary world, philosophical world. Probably his most famous friends were William and Henry James. Henry James, leading literary light novelist of 19th century America. William James, one of the founders of modern psychology. And they were, it's striking to see, here's Holmes, growing up with these people and maintaining these correspondence and friendships with them. They were, he was Bill, instead of William James. And it's also interesting to me, too, what an open mind he had. And you see in his friendships that although he was clearly religiously an agnostic and at times, would express his great frustration at the dogmatism of religious belief, still, here's one of his closest friendships is with this Irish priest, Canon Sheehan, who he met in Ireland. And he engaged in this really, beautiful correspondence with him. And he said at one point to another friend, he said, it's amazing that a saint like him would have a friendship with a heathen like me. He said maybe Catholic priests aren't quite as dogmatic as they make themselves out to be. But he was interested in people, and he was interested in everything. Actually, one of his law secretaries said he was interested in everything except athletics. And that comes through in this range of friendships he had.
Prior to the war, he went to Harvard for college. What was his experience like at Harvard?
Well, he clearly was already beginning to make a mark as a literary figure in a way, and I think he was, he suffered the usual uncertainties of what he wanted to do with his life, and he was drawn to philosophy, and he knew Emerson and actually went and talked to Emerson for advice about what he should do. And I think Emerson dissuaded him from being a philosopher, which probably is good advice. But and then the war comes in his senior year, and an extraordinary offhand, it was something like 2/3 of his Harvard class enlisted in the Union Army. Quite extraordinary. And, in some ways you see the kind of rage militaire, as the French call it, the sudden enthusiasm for war gripping these young men who don't really know what they're getting themselves into. But he definitely was also a believer in the cause very firmly, and a strong abolitionist. And one of the surprising things to me, which I hadn't realized, was that was something of a minority among the Boston elite. We tend to think of New England as the, ground zero of the abolitionist movement, and it was, but most of Holmes's, peers were wealthy people who had connections to the cotton industry, and it was also quite a widespread feeling of looking down on Lincoln as this crude Western politician, not really, not a Boston Brahmin by any stretch of the imagination. And so Holmes really being fired with the ideals of the Union cause was actually in a minority among the Harvard men who volunteered.
I was going to ask you specifically, what did he think of Abe Lincoln?
Well, he talks about this a few places later, and he said for many years after the war, I thought a myth was being created about Lincoln. He said, like most Boston people, I looked down on Lincoln. And he said, I remember during the war talking to a fellow officer, and we were musing about who would be remembered as a great man from the war. And he mentioned Lincoln. He said, but I think we both smiled. But then he said, I've since read some things that have made me change my mind. And he didn't really detail that, but I think he came to, I mean, he was such an avid reader of history and philosophy, among everything else. Though he said, "I hate reading about those years of the war." He was, although the war looms so large in his consciousness for the rest of his life, he wasn't one of these veterans who wanted to relive it and read about all of that. But he did read I know he read a few books about Lincoln. I think changed his mind, where he recognized his greatness as a statesman and leading the country through this peril.
And Holmes was injured several times in the war. Where did he fight? What was that fighting like, and what was the nature of his injuries?
Well, he was, nearly killed twice. It was almost miraculous survival. At the Battle of Ball's Bluff, he was shot in the chest, and the bullet missed, the lining of the heart by a fraction of an inch. At Antietam, he was shot through the neck by a bullet, if you can imagine that. And again, the bullet missed his, jugular vein, esophagus, spinal cord. It was, incredible. And each time he went back, and then at Second Fredericksburg, he was wounded in the heel by a piece of shrapnel from an exploding shell. And each time, he recovered and returned to his duty. He said when he was, I think, in his 90s or almost, he said, I don't understand why men fear death. He said, death and I are old friends. And, when also there was this famous incident where a whole bunch of public figures were sent bombs, and the one sent to Holmes was intercepted and before it was delivered in the mail. And again, I don't think he was just like bragging or, showing off with some bravado. He said he just shrugged it off, and he said, if I had to worry about all the bullets that have missed me, I'd have a job. But he said the Army taught me some great lessons. He said to endure being bored, he said to be prepared for catastrophe. And the third, very interesting for someone of his class and upbringing, he said, and it taught me to look up to people. He said that no matter how fine a fellow I thought myself in the usual course of events, there were other men I learned to look up to who I would have looked down on had not experience taught me otherwise.
So after the war, he turns to that long, lengthy legal career. By the way, did he always have an interest in the law? What sparked that specific decision?
It's an interesting question, and he sort of told different stories. And, it's not absolutely – it was never clear to me exactly where this came from. But he did say in one of his famous speeches about the path of the law, he said, you can live as greatly in the law as any other subject. I think what attracted him was the possibilities of real scholarship. And his famous book, The Common Law, was the outgrowth of that. And he felt, I have to do something great and important before I turn 40. And he just made his own self-imposed deadline with that. And it was clearly the chance to think, to do scholarship, and to engage in a real kind of philosophy of the law. That's what appealed to him. And I think, when he saw that possibility, it made he said, there's these years of just drudgery in learning the law. But that was the goal that I think stimulated him and made it worthwhile to him.
That book you mentioned, The Common Law, he was 40, as you said. 1881 was the date it was written. So I gather the chief, most famous quote from that book is this one. He wrote, "The life of the law has not been logic. It has been experience." What was he trying to say there?
Well, yes, that is the most famous quote, and rightly so. And he says it right, I think, in the second paragraph of the book. And what he was saying was the way the common law had been conceived of and taught and presented it was this fixed, eternal system of pure logic, of syllogisms. We say, well, you decide this case because of this general principle or this analogous case, end of story. And he said, well, actually, this is all, a myth we've basically given ourselves. The law, in fact, the genius of the common law is that it evolves, it changes through dealing with actual cases, and it's always evolved to meet, as he said, the felt necessities of the time. New situations arise, and that was especially true during the years Holmes was on the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, when you had industrialization and new problems of pollution from factories and workers' rights and workers being injured. How do you balance these new interests? And the idea, which it was always, the bugaboo that he had in his sights, and of this idea, there are these absolute rules of property rights. That's how we settle this case. And he said, look, the law has always been a balance of competing interests. It's finding a way to deal with problems that actually arise in the real world, and that's the genius of the common laws, that it allows itself to evolve. That was a very controversial view at the time, and it's now so non-controversial as almost not to even merit comment. But this book of his, The Common Law, really put American legal scholarship on the world map. Was praised in Britain. Scholars there said Americans are surpassing us in legal scholarship. It was probably one of the most important intellectual achievements in any field by an American in the 19th century.
So Teddy Roosevelt becomes president in 1901. A year later, he nominates Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. for the Supreme Court. What did President Roosevelt see in Holmes, and what kind of relationship did they have?
Well, this is another interesting look into history, because sort of how different the court and the court appointment process has become. There was a tacit idea that there were seats for different parts of the country, and a justice from Massachusetts leaves the court. And so there's an opening, and it's the Massachusetts seat to be filled. So that was sort of the number one thing. So Roosevelt was looking for someone from that part of the country. Their relationship was fraught, because Roosevelt clearly thought, I've appointed this judge, and he's going to do my bidding. And Holmes was a very independent thinker and refused to do so, particularly on this famous antitrust case. And Roosevelt was really beside himself and almost considered it a personal betrayal. And I think they patched things up more or less eventually, though I think that there was always a certain coolness after that. Holmes was not a man to be intimidated by that kind of pressure. And, of course, having lifetime tenure helps, I guess.
You mentioned
give you that confidence as well.
Right. You mentioned several types of major, big cases he was involved in. Take us a couple steps deeper on that free speech case and his involvement and what came out of that.
Yeah. Well, there were a number of cases, particularly during the First World War, where this issue arose, where the government was prosecuting basically what was viewed as seditious speech. Anything interfering with the draft was a crime. And so there were some pretty innocuous, like pamphlets protesting some aspect of the war, and the federal government charged these people with it was a quite serious crime with quite serious penalty. And Holmes and Brandeis together were, the lone dissenters. And Holmes really clearly, evolved his thinking about free speech. Holmes was a skeptic about rights in general. He thought, he said the rights of any given crowd are what they're willing to fight for. That was his view, a rather pragmatic one. He didn't accept the idea so much of rights as this, thing handed down from up above in the sky. And but I think he he really saw that, and this was his famous, usually misquoted, "shouting fire in a theater" line. He was trying to draw a line. He said, "Okay, how do we decide what's speech is protected by, First Amendment and what is not?" The old common law rule was any speech with a bad intent could be criminalized or halted by the government. A bad tendency, sorry. And Holmes said, well, he said every idea is an incitement. That was the argument. This pamphlet was an incitement to oppose the war. He said every idea is an incitement. And he said, yes, of course, he said the greatest defense of speech would not permit someone to yell fire in a theater and cause a stampede and people to be killed. So, but he said it has to be that close to an actual crime for it to be something that that could be outlawed. And that, again, was, an extreme minority view on the Supreme Court, and not many years later, it had become the accepted view.
Was
and it's still? Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead and finish, please.
No. That was really the end of my thought. I was going to
ask you, Mr. Budiansky, was Holmes married? Did he have a family of his own?
Yes, he was. He had a very long and devoted marriage, no children. And he had many very beautiful, usually accomplished, highly intelligent younger female friends, who he engaged in this wonderful correspondence with. And there's been, enormous speculation over the years what the nature of these relationships were. Holmes told a number of his close friends later in life, he always had a rather humorous way of expressing himself about these things as everything else. He said, "I've always loved the dames, but I've never stepped over the line." And I think that was probably true. It was, these sort of very flirtatious, but also, really deep intellectual friendship. And these younger women friends clearly just treasured this friendship of being taken seriously on an intellectual level by such a great and interesting man as Holmes was. But he clearly was very devoted to his wife, who was from a old Boston family too. And unfortunately, there aren't that many letters between them because they were living together all this time. There are only a few, but from friends and the things you pick up from people who saw them, it was a very deep and mutually devoted marriage.
As we wrap up, how did Holmes spend his final few years after he left the court?
Well, not doing much. He said, I feel like, he wrote to one friend, I said, I feel like a rock at the bottom of a stream with the water flowing over me. But, he was, throughout his life, a voracious reader. He kept a list of every book he read. There were like 5,000 books in this list. It was about one a week. And he kept up his reading. At that point, in his later years, he had his secretary read aloud to him. But still a remarkable range of books. He read Homer in the original Greek and Proust in the original French, and Dante in the original Italian, and he read P.G. Wodehouse and Virginia Woolf and books about science and economics and philosophy and sociology. So reading remained, I think, a very important thing with him up to the end. And he he still, kept his correspondence and friendships going.
Just a final question about legacy. What was the legacy of Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr.? How is he remembered today?
Well, I think he's most remembered for his dissents in the free speech cases, which came to have an enormous impact on our understanding of First Amendment rights. I think more important, in a way, was his challenging in the famous Lochner case. Again, one of the greatest dissents ever written, soon became the law of the land, challenging the idea that economic regulation was unconstitutional as a violation of the rights of contract. And his recognition of the federal court's role in guaranteeing fair trials, particularly involving cases in the South of Americans railroaded on trumped-up charges and convicted in matters of minutes of rape and murder and sentenced to death, with these basically sham trials. And before Holmes, this was not viewed as something the federal government could interfere in, and Holmes changed that.
Stephen Budiansky is author of the book Oliver Wendell Holmes, A Life in War, Laws, and Ideas. Thanks a lot for your time.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Books That Shaped America podcast. For more information about the series, you can visit our website, cspan.org/Books That Shaped America. And remember to follow this podcast so you never miss an episode.